Defenders of exclusive use of the King James Version in all their varieties frequently appeal to Psalm 12, 6, and 7 as a proof text for their doctrine that God promised perfectly pure preservation of the Hebrew and Greek texts of Scripture. Here's the text of those verses as they are translated in the 1769 Blaney edition of the King James. Notice particularly the two uses of the words them. The words of the Lord are pure words, as silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. Thou shalt keep them, O Lord, thou shalt preserve them from this generation forever. Two of the words that King James defenders most often use to describe God's preservation of Scripture, that is pure and preserved, are drawn from the King James rendering of Psalm 12, 6, and 7. Many of the most influential and capable King James defenders use Psalm 12, 6, and 7 in this way. In this video, which is slightly adapted from a journal article in the Canadian American Theological Review, I will do 4 things. First, I will establish that leading figures who defend exclusive use of the King James Version do use this psalm and these verses in the way that I've just described. Second, I'll then canvass in some detail the textual and interpretive issues presented by the relevant verses in the psalm. Third, I will conduct an interpretive plebiscite, a multi-century referendum on the meaning of these verses. In other words, I'll look at how dozens and dozens of interpreters throughout Christian history have understood these verses. Fourth, I will then propose an interpretation. First, let's listen to leading figures from KJV onlyism, observing their use of Psalm 12, 6, and 7 as a proof text. Thomas Ross and Kent Brandenburg are indeed leading defenders of exclusive use of the King James. The former has produced a declaration of my own position on the inspiration and preservation of Holy Scripture, to which the latter has given assent. The two men confess, quote, "The Bible promises that God will preserve every one of his words forever, down to the very jot and tittle, the smallest letter." Psalm 12, 6 and 7, 33, 11, etc. The Bible assures us that God's words are perfect and pure, and there's Psalm 12, 6 and 7 again. A footnote leads readers to an article arguing that the Masoretic vowel points are included among the objects of God's inspiration and preservation. Brandenburg has also argued in an edited volume focused on promoting a doctrine of perfect preservation, quote, "Inspiration is a miracle of God in which he supernaturally delivers every one and all of his words to men. Preservation is a miracle of God in which he supernaturally keeps every one and all of his words for every generation of men." As a proof text for the latter assertion, he cites Psalm 12, 6 and 7. Thomas Strauss mounts one of the two most serious cases available that Psalm 12, 6 and 7 promises perfect textual preservation of the Hebrew Bible and Greek New Testament. His argument extends to the message of the entire psalm, Psalm 12. He argues that Psalm 12 is a chiasm, with verse 5 serving as the hinge, the linchpin. Strauss says, quote, "The wicked asserted that their words would prevail or be preserved indefinitely. The Lord's response to this boastful claim was that his words and not man's would be preserved, each and every one of them, forever." Making verse 5 the verse that mentions the poor and needy, the linchpin serves actually to isolate it at the top of a peak from the rest of the context. In other words, it's Strauss's means of insisting that the psalm is about divine words and not about the poor and needy. Strauss demonstrates some linguistic sophistication by handling a now common objection to his viewpoint, one that we will examine in detail in this video, namely that the them in both "thou shalt keep them" and "thou shalt preserve them" is in Hebrew masculine, while the words of Psalm 12:6 are feminine, so that words is unlikely to be the antecedent of them. Strauss has an explanation for the gender discordance that he does acknowledge to be present in the Hebrew text. He says, "It is important for the careful exegete of the Hebrew Scriptures to recognize the biblical phenomenon wherein the biblical writers employed masculine pronouns in reference to feminine antecedent nouns when those feminine nouns were synonyms for the words of God." And he cites Psalm 119. Since the words of Jehovah are an extension of this strong patriarchal God, the Old Testament writers occasionally seem to use masculine pronouns for certain synonyms of the word. The biblical writers deviated from this grammatical norm for theological purposes, emphasizing specific truths. Peter Van Cleek Sr.'s An Exegetical Grounding for a Standard Sacred Text Toward the Formulation of a Systematic Theology of Providential Preservation, and he means preservation of the text of Scripture in Hebrew and Greek. Van Cleek takes the case further by referencing Gesenius's Hebrew grammar. He quotes these lines: "Through a weakening in the distinction of gender, which is noticeable elsewhere and which probably passed from the colloquial language into that of literature, masculine suffixes, especially in the plural, are not infrequently used to refer to feminine substantives." Van Cleek Sr. also demonstrates that 5 interpreters of standing either seriously entertained, that is Martin Luther, Matthew Poole, or actually advanced, that was Ibn Ezra, Michael Agwan, and John Wesley, an interpretation of Psalm 12:7 in which at least the first of the 2 relevant pronouns, "thou shalt keep them," refers back to the words of Psalm 12:6. Van Cleek Sr. also argues that the renderings in 8 early English Bible translations adopt his view. Jeffrey Riddle is a leading Calvinistic King James defender. He does not make regular use of Psalm 12:6 and 7, and his use is tepid, but he does appeal to it. Here's Riddle. "Though we might grant that the thrust of verse 7 is about the preservation of God's people rather than directly about the preservation of his word, that is not a point unrelated to the doctrine of the divine preservation of Scripture. Why can God's people have confidence in his ability to keep them? Because the Lord keeps his promises. He keeps his word. His word can be trusted in all generations." KJV-only churches frequently appeal to Psalm 12:6 and 7 as well to defend their views. Bible Baptist Church of Oak Harbor, Washington, to just pick one example, confesses formally that God's word has been, quote, "divinely preserved in the English language and is commonly known as the Authorized King James Version of 1611 AD. Among multiple proof texts that they list for their bibliology section, the great majority of which will be found in any standard evangelical systematic theology, there are proof texts commonly used by King James defenders, including Psalm 119:89, "Forever, O Lord, thy word is settled in heaven," Matthew 5:18, "One jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled," and Psalm 12:6 and 7. Now, let's turn to examining this text directly in the Hebrew. One of the ironies created by the use of Psalm 12:6 and 7 to buttress a doctrine of perfect textual preservation of the Hebrew and Greek is that the passage itself contains several textual and grammatical difficulties. So we must work to establish the text that we will then go on to interpret. There are 2 fairly significant textual and interpretive issues and 2 noted grammatical ambiguities in the space of just the 2 verses being covered in this video. The first textual or interpretive issue in the psalm is the precise meaning of the phrase that the King James translates as "in a furnace of earth." The first word in that Hebrew phrase is what's called a hapax legomenon, a word that's used only once in the Hebrew Bible, and it's most commonly taken to mean furnace. But what is a furnace of earth? Is this a furnace upon the earth? Is it a furnace made of earth, a furnace that spills its pure metals onto the earth? Or does the phrase have another reference entirely? Interpreters have noticed over time that the Hebrew word here might possibly be a corruption, maybe a purposeful one, of Baal. Perhaps then this phrase refers to the specially purified silver of the Lord of the earth. Interpreter McNeil is blunt. Quote, "The text in the second clause is corrupt." I'm not endorsing this view, to be clear, I'm just reporting it. Gill resorts to allegory, seeing furnace as a reference to Jesus, who purified all wisdom and knowledge by his sufferings and death, and gospel ministers, who endure fiery trials that harden the clay of their earthen vessels, and or to all the people of God, quote, "who dwell in earthly tabernacles, and who, in the midst of various afflictions, have a comfortable and confirming evidence of the purity and truth of the words of God, of the promises of his covenant, and the doctrines of the gospel." But most interpreters who can read Hebrew feel safe enough reporting the major views, issuing an academic shrug, and pointing to the overall meaning of the verse, which is clear enough. Indeed, on any reading, the verse is saying that the words of the Lord have a special purity, a purity that the psalmist then illustrates with some kind of metallurgical image, the precise nature of which is covered in some dross that has accumulated over the Hebrew through the passing of the centuries. A small footnote here, as I've pointed out in another video or 2 on this channel, the very passage that is used to prove a doctrine of perfect preservation of the Hebrew contains a Hebrew word whose form may have been preserved but whose meaning has not. Is this not a challenge for such a doctrine of perfect preservation? Onward. Of utmost importance for our purposes is the next textual/interpretive issue, which has to do with the two pronouns in Psalm 12:7. Look at it. You, O Lord, will keep them, or us, we'll talk about this. You will guard us, or him, or them, we'll talk about this, from this generation forever. I will refer repeatedly throughout the rest of this video to these two pronouns. Major English versions are all over the map here. Nearly every possible combination of the options is represented. You'll find them and us in the NIV, ESV, LSV, YLT, that's Young's Literal, JPS Tanakh, One Vulgate Edition, and the Matthew Bible of 1537. You'll see them and them in the King James, New Living Translation, International Standard Version, World English Bible, ASV, ERV, and Webster. You'll read us in the Clementine Vulgate, the Ancient Ethiopic and Arabic, the Dewey Reams, the Septuagint, the Christian Standard Bible, the Holman Christian Standard Bible, the CEV, Coverdale, and the Berean Standard Bible. You get them, him in the NASB, Amplified, God's Word, Net Bible, Geneva, and Bishop's Bible. Finally, you'll encounter him in Robert Alter's famous one-man translation of the Hebrew Bible that I've got in a box somewhere behind the camera that you can't see. There are multiple reasons for this variation, including a possible ambiguity in the consonantal text. As for the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran, two frustratingly fragmentary scrolls are relevant here. The Nahal Heber Psalms have the first relevant phrase and not the second. 11Q Psalm 7c has one key letter of the second, but nothing from the first. Put together then, the Dead Sea Scrolls offer, you, O Lord, will keep them, that's Nahal Heber. You will guard him or us, you can't tell, from this generation, that's 11Q Psalm 7c. As the bracket indicates on the screen, there's just one relevant letter left of the word at issue, and it could indicate either him or us, just like the Masoretic text. To make matters yet more complex, the Masoretic text is pointed to read them, him, but the consonantal text could just possibly be read as them, us, though Yuan considers the latter possibility dubious. And if you want to get footnotes, you'll have to read the paper in the journal. Adding to the textual uncertainty, commentator Peter C. Craigie in his commentary opts for us, and says that there's good support in the Hebrew manuscripts, and he cites DeRossi, Volume 4, number 6, for this textual choice. Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, the main edition of the Hebrew Bible, says only a few Pausi manuscripts, between 3 and 10, in other words, give us in 7a, and nonuli, that's between 11 and 20, give us in 7b. The United Testimony of the Septuagint, some editions of the Vulgate, and a few Hebrew manuscripts is powerful. Us is appealing. It also fits the context well. But the general principle that has guided most English Bible translations since the Reformation, most Protestant translation in general, is that the Masoretic text must be used except where it is unintelligible. And judging merely by the spread of renderings that they've chosen, many of today's English Bible translators indeed see the Masoretic text as too difficult here. Only the NASB, of all the major modern English versions, had the strength of conviction to match the Masoretic text with its difficult them, him. But where today's translators see confusion, many interpreters over the centuries have seen a fairly standard Hebrew method of poetic communication. The oddity of the Masoretic text was a known issue as far back as Calvin, who argues that the move from them to him is, quote, a thing quite common in Hebrew. Jacobson, the commentator, cites an example of a similar poetic variation in Isaiah 28:6 and 32:1. And he notes that, quote, even within the psalm, the faithful in verse 1 is singular, while the trustworthy is plural. And the poor and needy of verse 5 are plural, but the pronoun translated there as on their behalf, lo, is singular. In other words, he sees apparently stylistic number variation in other places. Interpretation will be left for a later section. Suffice it to say, them, him is more than sufficiently intelligible, and that Masoretic text priority will be assumed in this video. In the Masoretic text, them and him are both masculine. And in general, though interpretation is still to come, this grammatical fact would seem to answer an all-important interpretive question. What are the antecedents for these pronouns? Them and him are masculine, but the words of Psalm 12:6 are feminine. The most recent possible masculine antecedents are the poor and needy of 12:5. And if we all need a reminder, Waltke and O'Connor assert that the primary function of gender marking is to bind parts of speech together by concord in the same sentence or discourse. The most natural expectation, then, is that the gender of these pronouns solves completely the question of what their antecedent is. They simply must be pointing back to the poor and needy. Now, we've already met the view of Thomas Strauss, who insists that it is common in Hebrew for a gender discordance to exist between pronouns and their antecedents, especially, he says, when those words are the words of God. God the Father, he says, exerts a masculinizing force on his words. Very few interpreters even note the possibility that the grammatical gender of the pronouns could have a bearing on the choice of antecedents for the two relevant pronouns in Psalm 12:7. That is likely because, as this video will show, so few even consider words as a potential antecedent for either one of those pronouns. John Gill is one who tackles this issue directly, however, and he does not take Strauss's view. The antecedent of them, he says, is not the words before mentioned, as Ibn Ezra explains it, for the affix, that's the suffix, is masculine and not feminine. In the interest, again, of establishing the text upon which interpretation will be based, it will be helpful to briefly evaluate the arguments of Thomas Strauss. First, Strauss is right that gender discordance between nouns and pronouns occurs in the Hebrew Bible. He's right, too, to point to Psalm 119 as containing a few instances of this phenomenon. Let me point to two of his examples. I'll make relevant feminine words pink and masculine ones blue on the screen. Your testimonies, that's feminine, are my heritage forever, for they, that's masculine, are the joy of my heart. That's from Psalm 119, 111. Here's another one. Your testimonies, feminine, are wonderful, therefore my soul keeps them. That's Psalm 119, 129. But Strauss is unlikely to be right in his effort to read theology into grammatical gender, to say that God's masculinity leaches into pronouns referring to God's words. For then, how would he account for the places in the same psalm in which there's no gender discordance? Here are just three of them. Give me understanding that I may keep your law, that's feminine, and observe it, that's feminine, with my whole heart, that's Psalm 119:34. Here's another. Oh, how I love your law, that's feminine. It, that's feminine again, is my meditation all the day, Psalm 119:97. Here's another one. Your commandment, that's feminine, makes me wiser than my enemies, for it, feminine, is ever with me. That's Psalm 119:98. If theology about actual gender, biological sex, is to be read out of grammatical gender, what would it mean in the places where both the term denoting God's word and its pronoun are feminine? Does that mean that law and commandment and promise are more feminine than the apparently tomboyish testimonies? Hopefully, to ask this question is to answer it. Grammatical gender simply does not work this way. Further study by a skilled Hebrew grammarian might uncover more grammatical patterns worth noting here. The grammarian in question might answer questions such as, how often does gender discordance occur and under what circumstances? What is the linguistic reason for this discordance? For the purposes of this video, however, it's sufficient to acknowledge that the possibility of gender discordance remains that, a possibility. It does not point definitively to a specific antecedent for either them or him in Psalm 12:7. In my judgment, the masculine gender of these two pronouns leans the careful interpreter toward the poor and needy as likely antecedents, but the closer proximity of the words plus the demonstrated possibility of gender discordance leans the careful interpreter the opposite direction. I won't say how far of a lean each causes. Let's measure that as we go. The question of the antecedent of these pronouns, then, however, must be decided on other grounds. There is a final interpretive problem in Psalm 12:7, one that comparatively few commentators even mention, but one that has potential bearing on our main question in this video. There is an ambiguity in the two imperfect verbs. In the words of Luther, quote, the translator might have said more properly in the optative, do thou keep and do thou preserve, for this is properly a prayer of the prophet against the generation of justiciaries. But Hengstenberg disagrees. After specifically citing Luther, he says the context demands the expression of firm hope, not of a wish. Interpreters pay very little attention to this question. The weight of consensus is definitely with Hengstenberg and the most important ancient versions. The Septuagint's translations of these verbs are both future active indicatives, not optatives, as are the Vulgate's translations of these Hebrew words. And lovers of the Psalms know that the near requirement of the psalmic form is that you get an expression of hope here. Because an inspired prayer for divine preservation could bear the same doctrinal meaning as an inspired statement of that preservation, this grammatical question will be set aside. The question before us is whether the text, as now established, should be read to promise perfect manuscript copies of the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament. The primary way in which I will seek to answer this question is to demonstrate whether the text has been read to promise perfect manuscript copies of the Bible. I will execute something of a mass plebiscite, a vote, a referendum among Bible interpreters throughout the centuries. My major question is, who or what are the antecedents of the them and the him in Psalm 12:7? Much of what follows will merely tabulate votes for the plebiscite. Quotations will be given only when helpful for various reasons, you'll see. Assessment will, of course, follow along after that. I just cannot cover every single commentator who ever lived, but I did cite every single commentator whose work was accessible to me through the resources available to me. Since at the time I worked for Logos Bible Software, I had an especially rich selection to choose from, as you'll see. Let's start. Augustine commented on the Latin text available to him, which reads as he quotes it here, followed by his pithy comment, "Thou, O Lord, shalt preserve us and keep us from this generation to eternity, here as needy and poor, there as wealthy and rich." The objects of preservation and keeping for Augustine are clearly the poor and needy. The Jewish Madras Tanhuma of uncertain origin takes the same view. You, O Lord, will keep them, that is, watch over their instruction in their hearts. You will guard each of them from this generation unto eternity, from the generation which is worthy of destruction. The Aramaic Targum likewise says, You, O Lord, will keep the righteous. You will protect them from this evil generation forever. Already, we have seen what is most typical among the many dozens of interpreters that I surveyed for this video. They assume but do not defend an answer to the question that we are pursuing. What is the antecedents of them and him? Theodoret of Cyrus took the same view as Augustine, as did Cassiodorus and Diodor of Tarsus. Ibn Ezra is the earliest minority report, however. He issues a very brief comment in which he does refer the them of you will keep them back to the sayings of 12:6. Ibn Ezra does not mention the second pronoun, 12:7b. The mame of Tishmiraim, that is, thou wilt keep them, most probably refers to the words of the Lord. Rashi, centuries later, takes the opposing view, explaining, shall guard them as, quote, those poor and needy people being pursued by this generation who are informers. He's quite clear in not seeing them and him as referring to the words. Moving into the Reformation period, Luther sees a full 3 possibilities for the antecedent of them in Psalm 12:7a. While in the midst of a close reading of the Hebrew, he seems to prefer the words of 12:6 as the antecedent, but he immediately follows up with the other 2 options, the saints and even the wicked. Luther also perceptively notes the gender of the Hebrew pronoun. Listen to Luther. And instead of thou shalt preserve us, as the Vulgate reads, it is in the Hebrew, thou shalt preserve them. And it refers to the words of God, as Hieronymus, that's Jerome, translates it. But it may also be referred to the saints, as it is in the masculine gender in the Latin. Nor should I reject the acceptation, if anyone should understand it as referring to the ungodly, that God would preserve and guard them, that is, that they might not any more speak vain things, nor destroy the saints from the sons of men. Whereas Peter Van Cleek Sr. enlists Luther as a support for his viewpoint, when Luther comes to application, he actually conflates the first 2 of his 3 views. Listen to this. Here we see that it is not our power that can cause the words of God to remain pure, or that can prevent the saints from falling from among men, but the power of God only. Calvin, too, is aware that there is some disagreement over the proper identification of the antecedents in Psalm 12:7. Some give this exposition of the passage, Calvin says, thou wilt keep them, namely thy words, but this does not seem to me to be suitable. David, I have no doubt, returns to speak of the poor, of whom he had spoken in the preceding part of the psalm. Calvin notes the unique shift from plural to singular in the Hebrew of Psalm 12:7, which he quotes as them, him, and effectually draws a potential theological point from this minor oddity. He says the import of his language is, although only one good man should be left alive in the world, yet he would be kept in perfect safety by the grace and protection of God. That's how Calvin explains the number difference between them and him. I find that very interesting. Interestingly also, this point recurs in the Geneva Bible, and with minor variation through the centuries. It's found in Joseph Addison Alexander, A.F. Kirkpatrick, Hengstenberg, the Net Bible that I've got right here, and Jacobson. Let us turn now then to 17th century interpreters. The Westminster Divines did not cite Psalm 12:6 and 7 in their confession. When they confess that the text of Scripture was kept pure in all ages, they cite Matthew 5:18 and its every jot and tittle promise, and not Psalm 12. Though the Westminster Larger Catechism does list Psalm 12:6 as a proof text for its statement that the Scriptures manifest themselves to be the Word of God by their purity, it does not cite Psalm 12:7. Apparently, the Westminster Divines, whoever wrote the Larger Catechism, did not see 12:7 as a promise of textual preservation, or its omission would be difficult to explain. Commentator Matthew Poole acknowledges the possible ambiguity in the pronouns in 12:7. Thou shalt keep them, either the poor and needy, verse 5, from the crafts and malice of this crooked and perverse generation of men, and forever, or thy words or promises last mentioned, in verse 6. If one takes the second option, which Poole declines to do, he just doesn't land on a specific view, he suggests this interpretation, that is, thou wilt not only keep thy promise to me in preserving me and advancing me to the throne, but also to my posterity from generation to generation. And now to 18th century interpreters. H. Dimmock makes a textual critical comment that includes an interpretive one. One Hebrew manuscript with the Vulgate, the Arabic, and the Ethiopic, Hubagant, etc. reads Tishmerenu, which the context requires, Thou, O Jehovah, shall keep us. In other words, us in 12:7a commends itself not only for textual but for contextual reasons. Thomas Boston, too, writes, Because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But the saints shall not be carried away with the stream. Psalm 12:7. Thou shalt keep them, O Lord, thou shalt preserve them from this generation forever. Matthew Henry, the famous commentator, in his typical style, expounds on what the reader may now fairly call the standard interpretation of the pronouns in Psalm 12:7. He says, Let God alone to maintain his own interest and to preserve his own people. He will keep them from this generation, from being debauched by them and drawn away from God, from mingling with them and learning their works. In times of general apostasy, the Lord knows those that are his, and they shall be enabled to keep their integrity. And he also says they're kept from being destroyed and rooted out by them, that is, the wicked. So most of the exegetical and linguistic arguments regarding Psalm 12:7 were established by the 19th century. It remains mainly to tabulate interpretive votes from those who lived and worked in that century. In favor of the standard view are Kyle and Delitzsch, Tholuck, Bellarmine, in a commentary on the Vulgate and Dewey-Reams, Barnes, Hengstenberg, that I've mentioned several times, von Ewald, de Liguri, Adam Clark, Murphy, Jennings, Horn, Dixon, Hawker, Coles, Kirkpatrick, McLaren, and Spurgeon. I have all those citations in the journal article. A few interpreters of this century, notably Plumer, take the standard view and yet acknowledge that other interpreters refer one or more of the two pronouns at issue back to the words of 12:5. Two interpreters, Haydock and Briggs, dutifully report the various available views without landing on one. Only Neal and Brown, among all 19th century interpreters that I could find in many hours of searching, openly dissent from the standard view. Neal cites with apparent agreement 15th century commentator Michael Egwan as taking the first phrase, thou shalt keep them, as a reference to the words of verse 6. He says, keep them, that is, not as the passage is generally taken. Egwan, keep or guard thy people, but thou shalt keep or make good thy words, and by so doing shalt preserve him, the needy, the poor, from this generation. This is a quotation used by several King James and Textus Receptus defenders, including Brandenburg and Van Cleek Sr., but it must be noted that Neal goes on to see the second phrase, thou shalt preserve them, as referring to the godly and not to the words. Among 20th century interpreters, those who take the standard interpretation of Psalm 12:6 and 7, namely that the them and him pronominal suffixes refer back to the poor and needy, That list includes F.B. Meyer, Arno Gabeline, Alan Ross, and Willem van Gemeren. Kidner similarly sees "you will keep them" as possibly referring to the promises, and "you will guard us" as referring to the godly. Joachim Krauss and Erhard Gerstenberger follow the basic view of Neil, saying, quote, "You, Yahweh, safeguard them," your words, "you protect him," or according to some Hebrew manuscripts and the Septuagint, us, always from that kind of person. The voters line up again in the 21st century for the standard view: Goldengay, Longman, Furtado, Dahoud, Eaton, Harman, Grogan, and Jacobson. Samuel Terrian, however, takes "you will keep them" to refer to the promises that God has just made, and Jim Hamilton, whom I've met and interviewed personally, sees Psalm 12:7a as a promise that Yahweh will guard his words, and Psalm 12:7b as a promise that God will guard the godly ones, mentioned already in 12:1a. To be clear, however, Hamilton does not see this as a reference to the Bible, but to the words of promise that God has just spoken in this psalm. Two more interpreters bear mentioning, the two writers who made the only significant academic attempts I could locate to evaluate whether Psalm 12:6 and 7 has any bearing on the textual criticism of either testament or on a doctrine of preservation. John Feinberg is the only systematic theologian I could locate out of dozens who so much as mentions Psalm 12:6 and 7 with reference to the question of textual preservation. Feinberg feels that on the whole the Bible teaches, or at least implies, a doctrine of preservation, but after a very careful exegetical discussion, mirroring points that are already made in this video, Feinberg concludes, even though verses 6 and 7, isolated from the rest of the psalm, seem potentially to comment about Scripture, in the context of the whole psalm, verse 7 is not about Scripture at all. William Combs, second, dismisses the relevance of Psalm 12:7 to any doctrine of preservation. His argument hinges on the gender of the pronouns, and I have, of course, used that argument as well. Ironically, it is serious interpreters' dedication to a principle usually upheld by responsible King James defenders that keeps them from reading the key phrase in Psalm 12:7 the way the King James Version does. That principle is what I mentioned earlier, Masoretic text priority. Them, the reading in the King James, is ambiguous in a way that the Hebrew is not in the Masoretic text. The King James is rendering maybe an acceptable translation. A translator might feel that English speakers simply would not make a number switch from them to him, plural to singular, in a circumstance like Psalm 12:7. The translator might quietly regularize the number, make them both plural, according to English expectations, as the King James translators apparently did. But this is precisely why the Reformers fought to maintain the authority of the originals over that of mere translations. Hebrew trumps English. The King James translators' rendering innocently created potential for a doctrinal misreading. I could not find a single interpreter before the advent of King James onlyism who interpreted Psalm 12:6 and 7 to promise perfect manuscript copies of the Bible. And only a tiny minority of interpreters throughout history have seen both pronouns at issue, whatever they take them to be, to refer back to the words of the Lord in Psalm 12:6. Given Masoretic text priority, it's essentially impossible for him, the second pronoun in 12:7, to refer back to the words of 12:6. The object of preservation, "you will preserve him," at least, is not the words of the Lord. But it is grammatically and contextually possible that the first pronoun in Psalm 12:7, them, "you will keep them," refers back to the content of 12:5. Them is genuinely, but not, in my estimation, and I speak here with regard to the human author, it's genuinely, but not purposefully ambiguous. Keep, too, could point in either direction. Both people and things are kept in the Hebrew Bible. Adam must keep the garden. The angel later keeps the way to the tree of life. Abraham must keep God's covenant. God promises to keep Jacob wherever he goes. The Israelites must keep the Passover and the Sabbath. Clearly, lexicography, looking at the objects that keep can take, will not answer this interpretive question. But if this video may make a few observations that have not already been made in ages past, it is unlike Hebrew parallelism for them and him to point to different reference. It's too cute. It's more demanding of the reader than the form typically requires. In the context of this psalm, them and him both almost certainly refer back to the same reference, that is, the poor and needy of Psalm 12:5. Because the poor are plundered, because the needy groan, I will now arise, says the Lord. I will place him in the safety for which he longs. And another apparently new contribution of this video even if it were warranted to make the leap from these specific words of the Lord to all the words of the Lord, including all of Scripture, Hebrew and Greek, Old Testament and New, indeed, could any of God's words be impure? Context also puts some boundaries around the meaning of the word pure. Those who use Psalm 12, 6, and 7 to defend the existence of perfectly pure Hebrew Old Testament and Greek New Testament texts have not acknowledged this. They appear to assume that pure means free of textual corruption, or the yet more specific, free of textual variation. But that cannot be the focus of Psalm 12:6. The psalmist cannot be saying, the promises God just made to the poor in the previous verse will be copied perfectly down through the centuries. The psalmist has to be saying God's promises are completely reliable, unmixed with ulterior motives. Indeed, this is the way interpreters very commonly take Psalm 12:6. Augustine glossed pure to mean without the alloy of pretense. Craigie saw it to mean free from any falsity or impairment. In this sense, God's word has certainly remained pure in all ages, but not in the sense meant by King James defenders. Defenders of a perfectly pure textual tradition of the Hebrew Bible and Greek New Testament will be quick to say, but how can God's promises be perfectly reliable if they are textually unstable? Does not the latter imply the former? Well, does it? Do the kinds of variants generally found within the manuscript traditions of the Testaments change the message of Scripture? If one textual variant said, the poor are despoiled instead of the poor are plundered, would God's promises no longer be pure? This is the situation we frequently face in both Testaments, variants that are, in the words of Dan Wallace, viable but not meaningful. In other words, despoiled would be viable here, contextually would fit, but it would not communicate something meaningfully different from plundered. There are more serious variants in the manuscript traditions for both Testaments, of course. But there are numerous reasons to believe that no available text of the Hebrew Bible or of the Greek New Testament teaches a different set of doctrines than any other. For example, Christian theologians frequently cite Bible verses by reference only, implying rather strongly that it matters not what version they are looked up in. It doesn't even occur to the theologians to mention this. And precisely zero major doctrinal differences among Protestant denominations can be traced to differences of opinion on textual variants, with the possible exception of snake handling. And if we may turn from special to general revelation, there is no absolutely perfect text to be had. All of the manuscripts that we have of any size in either testament differ at least a little. A textual apparatus of a sort, the Catheve Curie readings, that's included in the very Masoretic text that's commonly said to be perfect by King James defenders. And yet there are no Urim or Thummim pointing to the Leningrad Codex over the Aleppo Codex. There are no apostles to draw straws to see which Textus Receptus edition is the perfect one, or whether the Nestle-Aland 28 should take the TR's office. Defenders of the King James and TR are persuasive to their own when they use Psalm 12:7 as a proof text, only because the King James translators chose to render the pronouns as them and them. If their translation had been one step more literal, or if they'd kept the bishop's Bible rendering during their revision process, which is, thou wilt keep the godly, O God, thou wilt preserve every one of them from this generation forever. If they'd done that, no King James-only doctrinal statements would be citing Psalm 12:7. There are serious, accredited Bible interpreters who, over the centuries, have seen in the first clause of Psalm 12:7 a promise for God to keep his words. Several of the most capable and diligent defenders of the King James have collected these citations. In my research, among approximately 60 writers, 6 saw Psalm 12:7a that way, and another 5 at least felt the duty to report that view as an option selected by others. But only one, apparently Hebrew reading interpreter I could find outside of the King James defenders that I've mentioned, saw the second clause of Psalm 12:7 as referring to the words. That was Arthur Brown, writing in a popular level book in 1884. An overwhelming majority of those surveyed, nearly 50 interpreters over the centuries, saw both pronouns as referring to the poor and needy. Majorities can be tyrannies. Bible interpretation is not a democracy. But if to the commentary tradition King James defenders appeal, to the commentators we must go. King James defenders often argue that God's use of a given text, the pericope adulterae, Mark 16:9-20, the Johannine comma, is indication of God's approval of that text. But what about his use of a given interpretation? The church has with great consistency seen Psalm 12:7a and b as a promise of God to defend the godly poor and needy. And even when a few interpreters over the centuries have pointed to the words and not to the poor and needy as the proper antecedent of them and him, the object of God's keeping, No interpreters, to my knowledge, have ever drawn the conclusion that King James defenders do as to the application of these words. No one has ever seen in the verse a promise of perfect textual preservation of the Bible. Charles Augustus Briggs, for example, who's quoted by several of the King James defenders that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, is an awkward champion for them to put forward, given that his argument is actually that the reason so many options exist among the manuscripts and ancient versions, them, him, us, etc. The reason is that, quote, probably all are interpretations of originals without any suffixes at all. The defender of the King James, who uses Psalm 12:7 as a proof text for his views, is not quite Athanasius against the world. He's Athanasius against the vast majority of the world, minus a few footnotes mentioning the possibility that Athanasius may be half right in his interpretation, but so wrong in his application that his application did not even occur to a single one of them before Athanasius came along in approximately the year 1980. Psalm 12:6 and 7 is a promise that God will defend the poor and needy, and that his promise to do so is both sincere and reliable. For admittedly rhetorical, that is, persuasive efficacy purposes, I omitted one key historical interpreter of Psalm 12:7. 400 years ago, the preeminent biblical scholars of England issued their judgment regarding the referent of both pronouns in Psalm 12:7. The King James translators themselves have a footnote at Psalm 12:7b. Them in Hebrew is him, that is, every one of them. For the King James translators to say him and to recognize that's what the Hebrew says is to point at least the second pronoun of 12:7 back to the poor and needy. They would have said Hebrew it if they felt that the suffix there was referring back to the words. And given that they regularized him to them to match the first pronoun, this almost certainly means that they regarded that first pronoun too to refer to the poor and needy. If the King James Bible of 1611 is the inerrant, infallible, inspired, preserved Word of God, its footnotes, presumably also inspired, undercut the very proof text used to add that word preserved to the list of doctrinal descriptors for the King James. As I have at sundry times and in diverse manners had occasion to say, the King James translators were not King James only.